talk together. It's just really exciting to talk to people that love birds and choose to love birds. I feel like I spend a lot of my job trying to trick people into liking birds more than they do. So it's a very nice to have a change of audience and to be welcome in this group. And also it was nice to think about these spring birds as it's very blustery and cold here in Duluth these past few days. But we had our first brown creeper in our yard this weekend too, and I was wondering if that poor little buddy was regretting his decisions because it's been very cold here these past few days. But anyway, so my name is Alexis Grinde. Like in the introduction, I run the Avian Ecology Research Lab, and some of you may be thinking, what is that? I didn't know we had one of those, and maybe some of you are familiar with Jerry Nemi, and that the lab used to be called Jerry's Lab, but we rebranded when he retired and I took over the lab. So it has been around at the Natural Resources Research Institute for many, many years. Jerry started the lab in the 1980s. And so we have a long history of bird research in the area. And really, I think I have the coolest job in the world because we get to do so many really neat and amazing things and learn more about birds to really help conserve them. And Duluth is the most amazing place to do the work that we do. But today I'm going to be talking to you about rusty blackbirds, which, when I was trying to think, what is a species that maybe people don't know that much about and could be interesting to a birding community, I thought about these guys. And so hopefully you guys will find this interesting and learn a little bit. It is not groundbreaking science. I sort of focused a little bit more on how we're actually doing the science and setting up the experiment. So I hope that is interesting as well. So our lab currently employs like 13 people. 6 of us are full-time. This is Jerry, who is the founder of the lab. And then Steve, Josh, Ryan, Annie, Lexi, Nick, Stephen, Reed. We have all these wonderful people that are super fun and just the best avian ecologists around too. But really our focus is we have a whole bunch of different research projects and monitoring programs. But the goal is to use birds as indicators of the environment to figure out ways to inform best land management practices, really for ultimately conserving their habitats, their populations, but also just our overall integrity of our environment as well. So a little context about why is bird research and monitoring really important. And this doesn't have to be necessarily bird research, but why is research and monitoring important for wildlife in general is because whether it comes to our minds every day or not, we have been losing biodiversity at a pretty rapid rate for the past 50 years. And that's happening certainly in North Dakota, or in North America. I had a flashback of where I used to live, but in North America, but also in Minnesota as well. And we need to monitor these things because really it gives us information about where should we focus efforts, what species are imperiled or what species need attention, and how do we make these science-based decisions to improve their overall habitat quality, their populations, but also our quality of life, right? In 2019, there was a really big paper that came out that documented the decline of most bird species since 1960, which is just when we started really monitoring them. And that we started monitoring birds at that time because it was sort of on the heels of the DDT and the really obvious declines of bald eagles and big raptor species like that. So we started these like North America wide breeding bird surveys, which some of you might participate in or have participated in before potentially. We used these different data sets and they documented these really devastating declines. And the saddest part is people that work in bird research, bird science, I don't think it was that surprising to us, but how widespread it was and how consistent it was, these population declines were across species and guilds of species was sort of, sad, I guess, devastating maybe to see. And so certainly in areas where Minnesota is, boreal forest, in the eastern forest, we see these declines in quite a bit of species as well. The big shining light here is that we did see an increase in some species that rely on wetlands. And so when we think about, well, we've done a lot of bad things since 1970 to our environment, and the birds are sort of showing us evidence associated with that. But what have we done right? Well, we can look at these wetland species and see that this is really a roadmap for saying, well, if we want to bring birds back, here's what we need to do. And these wetland species have seen population increases because we've put a ton of money and effort into conserving and restoring wetland habitat, especially in the prairie pothole region, and our neighbors in part of Minnesota, North Dakota, where there's a lot of migration area, a lot of breeding areas for ducks and other species that use that sort of habitat. When we look at some other science that has come out too, we do see that it is habitat that still is a huge driver of this loss of biodiversity and decreases in populations. And while that's a big bummer, and you're like, yeah, well, agriculture and development and all that stuff, it is really kind of good too, because we can put more habitat in the ground, or we can use restoration efforts to increase the quality of habitat that's there. So because it's habitat, we can do something about it, which is better than maybe like disease or collisions and towers and stuff, where that's sort of a little bit outside of what we might be able to do in terms of actually conservation effort. So in Minnesota, bird research and monitoring is really important because we're kind of a biodiversity hotspot in all of North America, especially for breeding birds. But also, you guys know Duluth is an amazing area for migration as well. And we have Hawk Ridge and all those wonderful scientists up there that are doing the banding and the counting of a lot of the raptors and passerine species as well. But we just have this wonderful matrix of habitat, different types of forests, the prairie parklands, aspen parklands in the state, and that attracts a lot of breeding birds, but it also attracts a lot of birds during the migratory periods too. And so those same areas that are really important for breeding during the summer become really important for stopover during the spring and fall migration. So because it's such an important area and because it's kind of a biodiversity hotspot, really, again, monitoring these populations, not just during the breeding season, but also during migration, and then thinking about what's changing and what can we do about it to help conserve these species makes my job really interesting, a little bit stressful, but also I think really impactful. So zooming in a little bit more spatially, talking about locally, the St. Louis River. The St. Louis River estuary was designated an important birding area in 2002, which is really incredible considering, I just moved to Duluth a few years ago and have been learning all about the St. Louis River estuary. And it's like literally amazing that there's so many birds there when you know about the history of what's been going on there for the past 100 or so years. I mean, so much industrial development, so much pollution. But then the shining star of that is that there's so much restoration and conservation and so much energy and science that's associated with that area to really improve it and bring it back from all the damage that had been done previously. We do a lot of research in the St. Louis River estuary and a lot of different bird species and habitats. But it is so critical because, I mean, it is a biodiversity hotspot in Duluth for sure. And of course, birding is very popular in Duluth. It's very important in terms of ecotourism. I don't know if you guys saw, but there is an article out from Condé Nast that identified Wisconsin Point as a birding hotspot that where everybody should travel to. So I'm sure the tourist industry of Duluth really is excited about that, because we do get so many people just coming to see that huge different variety of species. There's so much work by so many different agencies, the DNR, and Minnesota Land Trust, and the EPA, so many people that are doing restoration and conservation to bring back habitats for the fish, birds, everything that really relies on the estuary for life. So sort of shifting gears into some of the bird specific things, I just wanted to give an overview of what we consider the full annual cycle of birds, and sort of how we study birds is where do they go during these different parts of their life, right? So we can think about, this would be a neotropical migrant, the American redstart, where it's sort of showing, okay, here's the different places that it uses throughout the different time periods. So if we think about spring migration, which is happening right now for so many species, spring migration can be a really dangerous time because really a lot of the climate issues and stopover habitat as well needs to be there and needs to be high quality. If we have these big storms, these big rainstorms, these big windstorms like we've been having here in Duluth, these birds need somewhere to drop down and go. And it sounds like the waxwings are finding that in the Lakeside neighborhood, which is awesome. But really, whatever happens on spring migration is going to, of course, limit the number of breeding birds that get up to the breeding grounds, right? And then when we get to the breeding grounds, the breeding habitat quality interacts with what their condition was in the winter, plus how did they get here in the spring? Do they have enough fat reserves? Do they have the right hormonal balance? All those things to be able to do the breeding activities and lay high quality eggs to hatch high quality nestlings. Is there enough food available for those nestlings to survive and jump out of the nest and be able to fly away from predators? It's a tough life, right? And then those little nestlings, we hope that they'll survive and learn how to fly. And we see the fledglings, right? And build up enough fat reserves that they can start their migration behaviors to go back down south, right? And so we call it the fall migration. And again, stopover sites are really important for them to get back to their wintering grounds. And then depending on the species, the wintering grounds for most of the birds that breed in Minnesota or this area are somewhere in the southern United States or Central or South America. And what's going on the wintering grounds is really important because then they have to restore all their energy fuels and really get ready for spring migration to go back up. So it's an endless sort of cycle of danger and preparation and energy reserves if you're a bird, but hopefully it all works out. And the more individuals, the more young that we send down from our breeding grounds, the more that will potentially come back the next year, right? And so that's what we kind of want to focus on, and that's what a lot of our research focuses on. So getting to our species of the day, first of all, an overview of blackbirds. So when we say blackbirds, depending on your level of sort of birding, a lot of people, including many members of my family, think crows and ravens are blackbirds because they're black, but they're not. Blackbirds, it's its own family called Icteridae. And there's species like the yellow-headed blackbird, which used to be really abundant in the estuary and have declined, but now you see them, more pockets of them over in the western part of the state. We do have, of course, a lot of red-winged blackbirds. I bet somebody has seen those in different parts. Maybe I think I heard one out on Park Point this weekend, but I'm not sure if that was true or not. And then we have the grackles, which nobody likes, but are really cool. So you should learn more about them and give them a chance. Brewer's blackbirds, which is also over like in the more western area of the state. Bobolinks, which happen to be my favorite bird. The meadowlarks, orioles, and then down, we sometimes have yellow-breasted chat sightings here in Minnesota as well. But the one that I want to talk to you about is actually not a breeding species. It is a species that migrates through in really big numbers called the rusty blackbird. So rusty blackbirds, or rusties, as we say, they get their name. I actually thought when I first took ornithology, I thought it was because their song sort of sounds like a rusty hinge, you know, like a rickety old cupboard, but it's not, I guess. It's because, or maybe it is that, and because during fall and winter, they start having sort of a wearing of their feathers, and so it starts to look a sort of a rusty brownish color. But if you see them now in the spring and summer, the males are actually very glossy and shiny and fancy looking. And the females tend to be a little bit more silvery or sort of have a slatish gray color. So you don't see that really key rusty color at all times of the year. And one of the big identifying factors for rusties is that they both the adults, both the males and females, have these really yellow eyes. If you're interested in learning more about how to compare them to like different similar species, I would suggest rustyblackbird.org. It's the website for the Rusty Blackbird International Working Group, and it has a great resource and really good ID guide. There's a PDF that you can download. Anyway, so Rusty Blackbirds, why do I care about these guys so much? Well, they're cool. They winter down in the southern part of the United States, the southeastern part of the United States, and then they migrate really in high numbers through the Great Lakes area. And then when they get to Canada, they sort of split up, and they'll breed anywhere in the boreal forest, all the way from Alaska throughout the whole like boreal Canada, all the way over to the East Coast, which is crazy, right? They just sort of disperse out. And they like forested wetlands. And I know some of you have heard me talk about forested wetlands before. I love a forested wetland. And I think they are sort of the unsung heroes of the forest world. And they are facing a lot of dangers, I guess, in terms of conservation. A lot of really cool birds rely on forested wetlands. And here's just an example. This is sort of a hardwood swamp where you would find them, a typical habitat that you would find them in their wintering grounds in the southern United States. And then this is their boreal habitat or their breeding grounds, where it's more conifer, black spruce, different kind of spruce, I guess, depending on where in the range it is, but very sort of wet, marshy looking areas with trees that are available for their actual nests. I'm going to go ahead and play this animation. Hopefully it works. It does. So this is from eBird, and this is showing, citizen science observation of the rusty blackbirds migrating from winter up through the breeding season and now back down again. I'll just play that one more time so you can watch that. And I would just point out that right now, spring migration happens usually in mid to late April. The peak date according to eBird for the area is April 19th. So 10 days from now, mark it on your calendar, look for your rusty blackbird densities. And then in fall migration, we have really, really big numbers that come through the area. And it's really most of October, but starting the end of September, according to eBird, it's October 12th is where we sort of hit our peaks. And you can see these guys really easily anywhere along the lake and along the estuary, and really just kind of flying over, and they'll even stop down in your yard and throw some leaves around looking for some bugs if you have the right sort of litter depth that they're looking for. Okay, so again, why do we care about rusties? What am I talking about? Well, rusty blackbirds have experienced one of the most significant population declines documented in all of North America birds. So 85 to 95% of their entire population has declined in the past 50 years. It's staggering, even compared to all the other birds that we hear more about. Like, these guys have just plummeted. And the bummer is that we weren't paying attention. We were counting these birds, but we weren't really paying attention. And so only really relatively recently has the scientific community said, hey, you guys, have you heard about rusties? We should probably study them a little bit more. And so we think about why did we wait until really the past maybe 10, 15 years, maybe 20 years, there were some groups starting to do research on these guys. We say, why have we been ignoring them when other bird species get so much attention that aren't as imperiled? A couple of reasons. It's because they are pretty elusive. Like, they're not ones that are just going to show up at your feeder. You kind of have to go out and look in certain habitats to find them. Their preferred habitats aren't things that are easy to access. Forested wetlands aren't where people go willfully in the summer unless I'm paying them to do so as part of their job. And then also, I think we think about grackles and we think those guys are robust and they'll just find a way to survive. And we think that those blackbirds are generally very common and resilient. And so maybe we didn't look at their really species specific ecology and their real habitat needs as readily as we should have. So I think that's a good lesson for conservationists, especially those of us that study birds, that you have to have a species specific lens all of the time, and don't kind of make assumptions about different species that might be closely related, because they're definitely have those different niches. So why are they declining so rapidly? And it's one of these that isn't a silver bullet. It's likely a culmination of different factors. And it's a culmination of different factors across their annual cycle, right? So it's going to take a big, huge team effort and a lot of research to figure out what can we do to bring these populations back. So again, starting in the wintering ground down in the southeastern United States, over 80% in the past 50 years of the habitat that they rely on has converted from that forested wetland or that sort of lowland or hardwood bottom swamp kind of habitat to ag and neighborhoods and all these things that you would definitely expect. So loss of habitat means that they're hanging out in really high densities in the same areas, and they have found different types of diseases that have been transmitted. They're not sure what the population effects have been, but certainly it could be an issue. And then there's other species that are like grackles and red-winged blackbirds that are just really good at adapting to our human modified world. And they have increased a little bit in abundance too. And so there might be some competition issues that are going on in some of those habitats in the wintering grounds. On the breeding grounds, again, it's way less studied because it's very remote. It's hard, there's no roads, it's hard to access. So they're starting to figure out ways to monitor some of these breeding sort of areas, the important breeding areas. But just looking at it broadly, habitat loss and degradation, there's been some development. There's oil development that's going on in some of those areas. But climate change is one of the big driving factors. And again, with a forested swamp, climate change up in the boreal forest, we're talking about hydrological changes. And if I had to guess, it would probably be something with the insect community and the hydrology affecting the overall quality and food availability at different times of the breeding cycle. Rusty blackbirds have been shown to have high accumulation of mercury, and that is something that happens in these lowland conifer peat kind of systems. They think that it's tied to immune system and general health, but they don't know for sure. But another thing that's really interesting about these guys is that they have very leisurely southern migration. So during the fall, they take their time going from the boreal forest back down to the southern United States. And we haven't been able to study that really until recently with eBird, and then also some of these technologies that I'll be talking to you about today to figure out where are they going, where are they stopping over, and what kind of habitats are they using during their stopovers as well. So that's where we come in, right? And that's where the St. Louis River estuary comes in as well. So we knew from our friends at Hawk Ridge and our birding friends as well, that there was just really big migratory flights that were happening with rusty blackbirds every October. And the time frame sort of wiggled, but we would see just a ton of rusty blackbirds. We do a lot of surveys for different projects as for fall migration as well. And we were like, where are these guys going? What are they doing? How long are they hanging out? So we started a research project in 2019 that sort of is trying to chip away at uncovering the mysteries of the rusty blackbird in the St. Louis River estuary. We had so far have sort of addressed two questions. One is, what areas along the estuary do rusty blackbirds use, and how long do the individuals use these areas? So in fall 2019, we put out these this technology called autonomous recording units, or ARUs, and basically they're just these recording devices that we stick out in these like fancy boxes that have microphones, and we set them so that they record when we tell them to. So they'll record whatever they're hearing, like for an hour in the morning, an hour in the afternoon, an hour at night. And so we put them out at these different areas, which we knew was the habitat that they would like, because so they're really habitat specialists too. So it's not like they're going to just be hanging out in the Burger King parking lot like some gulls or something. They're really just going to be in certain areas. And so these are the ones we identified, and we knew that they were there from some of our previous surveys. So we set these ARUs out to figure out where we would hear them most often. And that's Steve Colby and Ryan Steiner on their boats going to check the ARUs and doing the surveys, having the time of their lives, of course. And so what we found is that, boy, there's a bunch of them in Rask Bay and in Mud Lake as well, as where we saw them with our in-person surveys. North Bay, we saw them quite often as well, but didn't pick them up as much on the recording units. And then Talus Island was another area where we had pretty high densities of them. And the thing that was interesting about the recordings is that sometimes they would be there during the day, sometimes they would be there later in the day, sometimes they'd be there in the morning. And so we figured out these sort of high use areas, but the ecology of what they were doing there and when was kind of a mystery as well. So we decided to keep going with the project and wanted to answer the question, well, when these individual birds are there, what are they doing? Are they just staying in, for example, the bird that's hanging out in Rask Bay, just staying in Rask Bay? Or are we sort of hearing the same birds in Rask Bay and it's cruising up to Talus Island or vice versa? Like, how are they using these different pockets of habitat along the estuary? So what we did is we set up these mist nets. For those of you that might not be familiar with mist nets, they basically look like a very fine mesh sort of volleyball net that are stitched together. And we put out this playback machine, which basically is just like a little radio that plays rusty blackbirds that sort of lures them in, and they fly into the nets. And we're monitoring them, and we just go grab them really quick out of the nets and untangle them, and then we have them in hand. So here, this is actually at North Bay, which is this site right here, for those of you familiar. There's a nice trail that kind of goes along the lake, and it looks kind of like an upland habitat, but really when you turn and look down, it's a really nice woody, shrubby kind of habitat where there are a lot of rusties that hang out there. Specifically, we were hearing them during the day. Anyway, so we put out the nets and we put out the playback machine, and the birds would fly into the net. Brian, and this is Annie Bracey, she's our master bander and holds all the banding permits for the lab. And this is Ryan Steiner, who is our other master bander, who has worked on a variety of field projects and is awesome at attaching different transmitters and so many different passerine species. But basically, we get the bird in hand, we take a whole bunch of different measurements, and you can see this bird is not happy about Ryan's finger being so close to to its bill. And we attach these transmitters. And so the transmitters are something called nano tags. And this little white thing right here holds the battery and also just a teeny little radio that sends out a really unique signal. So you can imagine it's something like ... You know, that's the signal that's unique to this one individual bird. And it'll send out that signal anywhere from 8 to 12 seconds, every 8 to 12 seconds that it has the transmitter on. So that's sort of step one. And I don't know if you can see, there's a very thin antenna that comes out. So sort of sends that, that message out into the world. And I'll tell you why that's important here in just a minute. But look at how beautiful these guys are. That's no silly grackle. That's not no silly red-winged blackbird. That's a beautiful rusty blackbird, and it's sort of amazing. And another key characteristic I should say too is that slightly curved little bill right there. So this is my little dude. He's 4. His name is Kai, and he did not go to preschool this fall, so he got to hang out with mommy when she went to check out on her field crew, and also got to release a rusty blackbird. And there it goes. And I said, how was it, buddy? And he said, good. So that was, and he still talks about it. That was sort of the highlight of his COVID year. Anyway, so what we were doing then, once we take these birds, is we set up these automated telemetry towers. I call them magic bottles, but it's not sciencey, but they're these automated telemetry towers, and they're just temporary. And basically what it is it's this Rubbermaid, and inside the Rubbermaid is a microcomputer that we have programmed to listen for that ... that each individual bird is sending out with their transmitter. And when the towers hear that, they record the time, the date, and the pattern or the ID of the bird. So we put out these towers all along the estuary in the habitats that we knew that they were using from our previous year using the recorders. Here's just some images of our team setting up the towers. Basically, it's just PVC pipe that we use to get the omnidirectional antenna very high up in the sky, as high as we can get it, so that it'll stay stable. And then just a fencing garden post to hold that up and keep it straight. And then that antenna is attached or has some coax cable that's coming down, and that goes into the Rubbermaid bin. And it's a pretty simple sort of setup. This is Annie Bracey again, Steve Colby setting it up and working out in the office, and we're having fun because we probably just saw each other for the first time in many months when I took these pictures. So as we take the birds, set up the towers, basically we're just then waiting for the birds to move around and then going to collecting the data off of these automated telemetry units. Overall in 2020, 35 birds were tagged, which was actually phenomenal. When I wanted these guys to start this project, I was hoping for just 15, and we were able to catch 35 and put the tags out. And again, like I said, the recording, just really basic information, bird ID, date, time, signal strength, so how much were they moving in and out of these focal areas. And again, as the bird sort of moves along, we're seeing that a bird might go from this area to this area, or from this area over to this area. And we can get some detailed information about individual movement. But really what our basic information that we were looking for is, how long are they staying here? How long does one individual bird stay here? And so this is really my only data slide. And it says that 40% of the birds that we caught only stayed 1 to 2 days. Now, we don't know how long they had been here before we caught them, or maybe we chased them out of there because we stuck them in a net and put some jewelry on them and they wanted to just leave the area. And so that's definitely not unexpected. But what was very unexpected actually is that 17% stayed for about a week after we caught them, 20% stayed for about 15 days, so 2 weeks, but almost 25% of them that we caught stayed for almost a month. So they're staying in Duluth. A large portion of these individuals were staying in Duluth almost as long as they were up in their breeding grounds, which means that the habitat quality that we have here in Duluth is as important as what's going on in the breeding grounds, which means that the conservation efforts that we put in here and figuring out what they're doing, how does their body condition change when they get here and when they stay here, why are they staying here so long? What are they doing while they're here? What other habitats are they using that we weren't looking at? All that is so important and a vital part of their overall conservation plans. And so because of this data, actually, I was asked to be a part of the International Rusty Blackbird Working Group so that we could start putting pieces of the puzzle together from what the research is finding in other really important parts of the range, including in Canada, but also they breed in Maine. They migrate in pretty high numbers through the Ohio area. And then there's also some working research that's going down in the southern part of the range for the wintering program too. So I'm really excited. This is basically just evidence that we need to learn more. This is really important for this species. And I'm really excited to be able to continue this research this coming year and hopefully for a long time to come as well. If we just sort of think about, again, the bird's annual cycle, migration and stopover are really, really vulnerable times. And in fact, these numbers are just saying that birds are more likely to die during migration than either on the wintering grounds or on the summer grounds. And so whether that migration is because of predation or window strikes or disease or any of these things associated with maybe lack of stopover habitat, because we know now, because of this data that we just collected, that what the birds are doing here for Rusties is really, really, really important. We can really have a big impact for their populations potentially. And I think that is amazing. When I first started school, I thought I might have to go to Africa and study chimpanzees or gorillas or something to have an impact in the conservation world, but really it's just right outside in the beautiful St. Louis River estuary. So the birds are in a very vulnerable and precarious situation, but also their habitats are. So in Minnesota and a lot of their stopover breeding range is this forested wetlands. And in the Great Lakes region, a lot of the trees are black ash trees that make up this forested wetland type habitat. And I'm sure you guys have all heard of this little bugger called the emerald ash borer. We know that it's in Duluth, and it has been documented in Duluth for many years. It hasn't had a huge spread yet, but I'm sure that's just a matter of time. But one of the biggest issues in another project that we work on is looking at the impacts of emerald ash borer and the mortality of black ash. Because emerald ash borer, once it gets into a stand, it kills 99% of all the black ash trees. And so if we just go back and say, well, this is black ash, and this is where the rusty blackbirds are hanging out during stopover, what's going to happen? Where are these blackbirds going to stop over? What kind of habitat restoration do they need in order to get a habitat that's appropriate for them to continue to use for stopover in this area? There's a lot of questions that we need to answer, and we have to do it really, really quickly because of the sort of imminent dangers associated with the degradation of those forested wetlands. So we're looking at mitigation of EAB and black ash mortality, not just in the St. Louis River estuary, but throughout all of northern Minnesota's forests as well. And I will say, just aside from rusty blackbirds, that breeding bird communities are really unique in black ash stands, forested wetlands, because they provide such unique habitat, and probably insect community, which provides very important food for these birds too. So what happens to black ash matters a lot, and it'll change the landscape of our forests and definitely our breeding bird communities as well. So take-home message: rusty blackbird populations are in very steep decline. St. Louis River estuary provides vitally important habitat for rusty blackbirds. And we know that, we have the data. It's really exciting, and it's really a big responsibility as well. Rusty blackbirds use the area for much longer than a typical migrant that comes through Duluth and usually leaves in a couple of days. We're talking a month here, right? Habitat quality and quantity within the estuary could have a disproportionately large effect on rusty blackbird populations. And so we're gonna talk about that as loudly and as forcefully as we can to get people to hear it and do what we can for these birds. So what's next for us? We're gonna track more rusty blackbirds into the fall. We think that they roost or sleep out on those islands in the estuary, for those of you that have been out there. So we're gonna probably put some towers up that way. We're going to do some drone flights to figure out the habitats that they're using to help us with some restoration efforts potentially associated with that loss of black ash. We want to start looking at spring. Unfortunately, we weren't able to do that just because of COVID, but hopefully next spring we'll start looking more at spring migration numbers and doing some studies there. And we're also going to expand into the Wisconsin side of the river, where there's a lot of forested wetlands as well. What's next in terms of the bird lab and things that I thought Duluth Audubon might be really interested in is that I'm working with National Audubon to put together a St. Louis River estuary BioBlitz, where we just want to document all the birds in the estuary for a certain amount of time. And so anybody that's interested in birding could definitely participate with that, no matter what their birding level is. And so I'll probably just plan to send details out to the contacts at Duluth Audubon as we get more details about that. I'm not sure about the timing exactly, but it will be coming very soon. And then lastly, I just wanted to mention a project that we have at Hartley Park on black-capped chickadees. We're using very similar technology as I described with the rusty blackbirds. Here we're interested in a couple of things. One, do our transmitters work in the winter? And two, how much do black-capped chickadees move around in the winter? We want to know that because one, chickadees are adorable. Two, we needed something to get us out of the house in the winter. And three, we're doing other sort of chickadee studies, boreal chickadees and black-capped chickadees in other parts of the state. And it was nice to just pilot it near home And we're also looking to involve citizen science a little bit more into our research. And so this was a nice way to sort of stick our foot in the door this year, and hopefully we'll continue to build on it. But basically we wanted to figure out how much of these chickadees, which we know there's a ton of them in Hartley, how much do they move around really? And so what we did is we set up these feeding stations and automated telemetry units that look very similar, with a sort of Rubbermaid bin and a PVC tower at these different locations. For those of you that are familiar with Hartley, there's the Hartley Pond, there's sort of the Pines, here's the feeder of the big parking lot. Anyway, we set these up, we put out feed at a certain rotating sort of schedule just to see if the birds that are tagged, the same way that the rusty blackbirds are tagged. Here you can see the antenna, the very thin antenna, are tagged and banded, are how much they move around from feeder to feeder. The park is about a mile kind of squared, and that's how we set it up. And we had a lot of different hypotheses about how much they would go from one feeder to the other. And then we did some handheld telemetry and just resighting of these color bands. We were put out flyers to see if we could engage local birders, but it turns out a lot of people just go to Hartley for skiing instead of birding in the winter. And so we're hoping to get more and more interest, as we sort of advertise it more, but we're just seeing how it would work. But we're hoping if you guys are out at Hartley and you bring a pair of binos with, you'll see some of our birds and see the tags. And if you see any of them, just write them down, tag your location with your cell phone, or you can just give us a general location of where you are as well. And then if you just email us whatever information you were able to see or find associated with the banded chickadee, and email it to us. This is our email associated with the chickadees, hartleychickadees@gmail.com. We're going to be doing this for the next couple of years. So, even if out in the summer and you see our banded chickadees, definitely let us know, tell your friends. We'd love to get more citizen science observations about these little guys and how they're using the park. So with that, that is all I have for you guys. I hope that was interesting and you were drinking tea and relaxing and enjoyed listening about birds. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Alexis. That was great. Yeah, I second the applause. That was really good. I learned a lot. So we'll open it up for questions. Please just unmute yourself if you have any questions. I have a couple, but I'm going to wait and I'll let someone else go first. Go ahead, Greg.
Yeah, a couple years ago, actually 2 times maybe in the last 8 or 9, 10 years, there have been experiences in the spring where migrating birds overshot their food sources. Once I remember there was a huge outflow of warblers on Park Point. Another time I remember many passerines moving. I live at 21st on the lake shore. And I remember many birds going by and then coming back that next morning, weary and hungry and unable to navigate. And many of them, I was out waiting all morning to keep them from flying into my building. But the thing is, with climate change, is this more and more of a problem for spring migrants, that they overshoot their food source? I'm thinking like a spring like this now, we've had these really a pretty early March and now warmth in April and rain, and will that bring birds up? And then if we got a cold snap and some freezing wind or a strong storm off the lake, birds could be in trouble quickly. And I'm just wondering what you know about that from the research that you're doing.
Yes, I think so. I will say with the caveat that there's no science to support what I'm about to say. This is my opinion. But so there's some birds that are neotropical migrants that are down in Southern and South America. And those guys seem to be mostly okay because their migration pattern is sort of more tied to daylight, right? So which isn't changing associated with climate change. So they seem to be sort of still migrating back at a regular interval that they have been historically, if you want to call it that. But there's a lot of bird species that are more short distance migrants. that I think what you just described is having a huge impact on them, actually, because they're like, you can just kind of imagine them being at the starting line, or, and then just sort of being really eager to get ahead of the race, get to the breeding grounds, establishing their territory. And then we have these huge, like, May snowfalls or like big, huge wind events. And they're like, oh no, like my little brown creeper that I said was in my yard this weekend that I'm a little worried about. And then they're like, oh no, and whether they have mortality or it costs them energy and they can't defend their territory. So there might be actual, like, real population impacts or carryover impacts into the breeding season where they're just not as successful as they might have been because they spent all their energy sort of recovering from the spring weather. I think it's certainly probable. And what I can say that is actual science is for our monitoring projects that we have in Chippewa and Superior National Forest, is that we are seeing declines in populations of those short distance migrants more than the longer distance migrants that maybe wouldn't be as impacted by weather, because they're still kind of arriving towards the end of May based on the sun. So take that for what it's worth, but I think you're right on, and I certainly think it's affecting quite a few species. Winter wren, yellow-rumped warblers might be a couple of examples.
Why do you think the Rusties don't breed in the boreal forest we have here in Minnesota and at the northern edge?
So that's a really good question. So they do breed in Maine. Like, the only part in the United States where they breed is in Maine, and the habitat there is very similar to what we have in Minnesota. Some folks have told me that there used to be some observations of Rusties in the Boundary Waters area, like the very northern part of Minnesota. I couldn't find really any great evidence for that other than just potential observations. And so it could have been that they used to before we started really monitoring them, and they're not like great observations because it is such weird habitat that they're hanging out in. But I think it's probably, evolutionarily, they went all the way up there to get away from all of their little buddies that are a little bit more habitat generalists and just have that decreased competition. And it worked really well for them for hundreds and thousands of years. And just in the past 50 or 60 years, the big changes, it started being not so great strategy for this amount of time. So that doesn't really answer your question, but that's sort of how I think about it.
Seems like a possible trip for research to me. That's how I hear the answer there. I think we have time for one more question, and Jeff joined, and Jeff would like to make some announcements or a couple announcements at the end. So any other questions?
I'm just curious, what is the diet of rusty blackbirds up in the spruce forests and bogs? Do they eat spruce budworms and things like that? What principally do they go after for food?
So I can't believe I didn't mention that. They love the leaf litter insects. So they're on the ground kicking up stuff all the time. And that's actually how you can really recognize them, especially in migration too, is that they're on the ground and they love a litter layer. But in the breeding grounds, it's of course dependent on what the actual tree type is, but it's the deeper sort of vegetation layer, not necessarily the litter layer like it is here. But they're kicking up insects largely. And I mentioned mercury too. And so if you think about sort of the aquatic cycle and the mercury being in the water, and then the insects having their life cycle there, that's how they're getting the mercury into their system, likely.
Okay, I'm going to ask one last question before we cut you loose. I'll be up there on Hawk Ridge in the fall during migration, and I listen, and I'll be darned if I can figure out how those people can ID Rusties on the wing when they're zipping over. Any tips on that? I'm like, that's a blackbird to me. I don't get it.
Yeah, I think it's just the answer that's annoying to all birders is just keep doing it with people that know it, and it'll just click in.
I just believe them. That's all. I'm like, okay.
Yeah.
I mean, when
and
they're way out there, they're little specks. I'm like, how the heck are you doing that? But
I know. And, you know, I think that, it's, you just get more confident the more confident you are too. So there's that.
well, again, thank you. I see Jeff joined and he is ready to say something or ask. So I think you can unmute yourself and I will stop recording here so I don't forget. Go ahead, Jeff.
All right, so just a few announcements. We are all getting geared up for migration to kick into gear here, and so we're excited about